Hello there, so everything about the beatmap listing page should be self-explanatory. Search keywords in the box at the top, and filter those results further with the options below. Filters that aren't understandable at first glance are clarified on the respective pages, like the qualified beatmap listing has a header that says, "What is a qualified category, you ask?" and the loved listing has its own equivalent. There is one head scratcher though. The first category here is called ranked and approved. These two words sound like they're the same thing, like synonyms for official content. But then the next category is approved. Seems even more redundant, and that redundancy turns into confusion when actually checking out that category. Unlike qualified and loved, approved has no header, so there's no immediate way to understand its purpose. Listed here are 236 map sets, most of which are single difficulties and all of which act the same as ranked maps, housing a leaderboard and rewarding performance points. The last map set to enter the approved category was from August 3rd, 2015, which means there's been over 2 years without any changes. So, how did it come to this? What's the difference between ranked and approved? Clearly, this situation is weird, but there must be a reason why things turned out the way they did. Well, let's go back to the ancient days of Osu and see how the approved section took form. I'm sorry in advance, this is going to be hard. Try to imagine a world without performance points. In 2008, ranked score was the main ranking metric for players. Playing different ranked maps would earn a player more ranked score, and so whoever farmed the most score would be at the top of the overall leaderboards. Not every map was the same though. Generally, shorter maps gave less score than longer maps due to their respective combo counts. To keep the ranking system somewhat fair, some maps were completely barred out from official ranked status, despite being enjoyable and meeting necessary quality standards, the most notable example of which being the 30-minute marathon titled Para Max. While at the time, a rule on the ranking criteria disallowed maps from passing 10 million ranked score, Para Max had the potential to reward players 500 million score if ranked, which would easily cause imbalance on the overall leaderboards. To avoid that, but still give special gimmicky maps or longer ones like Para Max their deserved exposure, a new beatmap category was created on July 31st, 2008, called Approval. For a modern day comparison, think of early approval like the loved category with some level of quality control handled by beatmap nominators. Sensible maps, unsuitable for rank, were instead approved, permitting them an online leaderboard but not the ability to affect user page stats like play count, accuracy, or the big one, ranked score, and therefore not affecting the overall player leaderboards. To get a map approved, a mapper would need to receive 3 nominations, 2 bubbles and 1 flame, as opposed to 2 nominations needed for ranked maps, 1 bubble and 1 heart. In-game, the difference between ranked and approved maps was eventually made clear by a warning message and little icons in the top left reflective of those nomination forum icons. And, of course, Para Max was the first map to be promoted under this new system. The approval category allowed mappers to create cool maps and show them to the world without adhering strictly to the ranking criteria. Sounds like paradise, what loved should have been, but it's not really what you're thinking. Only a small minority of approval maps were focused on fancy gimmicks. Most broke the ranking criteria in ways that seem silly by today's standards, and because of the quality control in place, they weren't all that different from ordinary ranked maps. Past a certain point, the ranking criteria made sure of that actually. With a new rule set published at the end of 2011, the requirements for approval maps appeared to no longer support special gimmicky maps. The ranking criteria stated, approval maps must follow the same rules as ranked maps, except for max score, length, and difficulty spread. For the most part, these exceptions are silly by today's standards. Max score referred to a rule saying no difficulty is allowed to exceed a score of 18 million points. Length referred to a rule stating the maximum time for a map is 4.5 minutes. The last one, difficulty spread, referred to a bunch of rules. To sum them up, a proper difficulty spread of easy, normal, hard, etc. wasn't necessary, the limit of 6 difficulties per map set could be surpassed, and map sets could have more than 2 difficulties of the same level. Despite supposedly requiring the same standards, beatmap nominators judged ranked maps and approved maps in clearly different ways. A common trait among approval maps was their ridiculous difficulty, as seen in iconic entries like Scarlet Rose, Big Black, and Freedom Dive, all of which were approved after this rule was set in place. You'd never see this kind of mapping in the ranked section, but for the approved section, it was considered okay. Special gimmicky maps, despite not even being mentioned, were valid to some degree too. Anyway, soon after this new rule was put into place, the biggest change to approval began to take shape. In November 2011, Pepe casually mentioned that the separation of approval and rank wasn't really worth it anymore. Score was just a bad way to measure player skills, so approved maps might as well be merged with ranked maps and have an impact on ranked score. It's not like this change could be done overnight though. The overall leaderboards would still be completely screwed if approval maps gave a ranked score, which meant something had to change. 5 months later in April 2012, PPV1 was released, the new way to rank players on the leaderboards with performance points. The details of PPV1 aren't worth explaining. What mattered was ranked score was no longer in control of the leaderboards, so mapping no longer had to work around its limitations. In May 2012, the maximum score and maximum length rules on the ranking criteria were removed. That should have eliminated the need for approval altogether, since a lot of approval maps only broke those two rules to begin with, but this ranking criteria change also included modification of approval requirements. Marathon maps will be able to ignore the difficulty spread rule. Marathon maps are anything that is 6 minutes or longer. You may be given some leniency, but ultimately that is up to the ranking bat. From this point forward, length was supposed to be the main defining factor for approval. Creating a 6-minute map was a way to avoid mapping low difficulties. Anything else would need a progressive spread suitable for rank. But, well, things didn't quite go like that. Even after this new rule was announced, maps continued to be approved under the old score threshold requirement because approved and ranked maps still hadn't been merged. Despite PP being introduced, approved maps still didn't add to ranked score. That did change though at the end of August 2012, so shortly after, the new approval rule was put into place. Marathons 6 minutes or longer were the only maps permitted for the approved category, with exceptions given to those maps challenging in special ways as decided collectively by beatmap nominators. I don't know what exactly defined a special challenge, but this exception allowed maps like Talent Shredder to get approved, which we talked about last week, and Blythe, which is, well, you don't need someone to explain why this map is special. Being approved in December 2012, this was sadly the last exception to the marathon requirement though. According to some ranking criteria discussion, gimmicky maps were still approvable for some time after this, but gradually that perspective shifted to only approving marathons. By 2014, there was essentially no difference between the ranked and approved categories. Mapping-wise, they had extremely similar content, only one required a spread and the other required 6 minutes of playtime. Score-wise, they were handled in the same way. Approved maps affected ranked score and performance points, just like ranked maps. There wasn't much reason to make the distinction between categories, so on February 19th, 2014, the last approval map was added to the approved beatmap listing. From then onwards, approval maps were only added to the ranked section. Instead of showing a flame in the song select menu, new approval maps showed hearts, just like ranked maps, and so the approved section was left to rot. Aside from this map, we'll talk about that later. But anyway, ever since the new marathon rule was put in place, mappers weren't happy about it. 6 minutes of mapping is a lot of work, and it's especially frustrating to know that maps before the rule could get approved with less than 4 minutes of mapping in a lot of cases. Mappers nagged for change to the ranking criteria, hoping to loosen the length prerequisite, and it actually happened. In April 2014, the 6-minute threshold was changed to 5 minutes, and that's been maintained ever since. Maps, even today, can be ranked with 1 difficulty so long as it surpasses 5 minutes of total train time. This change was a victory for mappers, though only at the start. As should have been expected, lowering the threshold only stopped mapper complaints for so long. Eventually they rose back up with the same logic as before. 5 minutes was now too much, and mappers wanted the threshold to be even lower. Plus, the idea of 4-minute 59-second maps requiring full spreads and 5-minute maps not just seemed unreasonable. People wanted a few seconds of leniency for maps close to 5 minutes, and you can probably see where problems could arise from that. The more leniency given, the more mappers will try to lower the threshold, meaning the line had to be drawn somewhere. Since the change in 2014, a strict 5-minute minimum for approval has been enforced without exception. So then, what the hell is this? The real last map in the approved beatmap listing appeared on August 3rd, 2015, a year and a half after the previous entry. It's a full map set of a 4-minute song with generic mapping, and I don't actually know why it's here. Well, I don't know fully at least. At first, the map was sent to the qualified section after receiving 2 nominations, just like any other map. The QAT disqualified it for a minor issue, which was immediately fixed, and it received 2 nominations again. It should have gone to the qualified section from here, but it instead skipped straight into the approved section. That second nomination was where things somehow went wrong. Instead of making a new post for the map set's heart icon, a beatmap nominator edited one of his old posts from before the disqualification into a heart. He's covered his tracks since then, but that's really the only thing different about this map's ranking process, which shouldn't have affected anything. Unlike in the past, there wasn't an approve button to send maps to this beatmap listing, there was only a qualify button. I don't know how he did it, but this Sieg guy sent an ordinary map set to the approved section. Nothing about the approved beatmap listing has changed since that day, but there have been a few minor adjustments to approval behind the scenes. In October 2016, the song select menu icons for maps changed due to the introduction of the loved category. Ranked maps were previously represented by hearts, and old approved maps were represented by flames, but after the change, loved maps use hearts, ranked maps use this double chevron thing, and old approved maps used a check mark. Flames were still used on the forums when qualifying marathons up until just recently, June 2017. Approval maps used to require 3 nominations, but as of a couple months ago, they only require 2, and that second icon is no longer required to be a flame. Tons of nominators, myself included, use heart icons when qualifying marathons, making the flame icon useless. With this final change, the promotion process for both ranked and approved maps became the same, so the difference between the two groups has almost completely disappeared. The only distinction now is the 5-minute length requirement on approval maps, which permits them to exclude a full spread of difficulties. That is it. So, we've come a long way since the original score and gimmick-based selection for approval in 2008. By now, you should have a good understanding of why the beatmap listing redundantly separates ranked and approved here. The approved category exists for the sake of legacy, containing approved maps between 2008 and early 2014. New approved maps, being the same as ranked maps in every way apart from length, are treated as such. They're contained in the ranked and approved category, not the approved one. In the past, there was a good reason to separate the two, but now their differences are near negligible, and so they're grouped together. Why this approved category is still so prominent on the beatmap listing page is the only thing that concerns me. Being placed next to the ranked section would make anyone think it's still important, yet it hasn't been updated in years. The only reason I can see to have it around longer is to relive its original purpose: promotion of special maps unsuitable for rank. And by that, I mean it could be the new home for loved maps, as proposed on a thread discussing the current state of the loved section, since in a lot of ways, loved is already the same as the oldest form of approval. Funny how things repeat themselves. Anyway, that should clear things up for people who don't know the history of approval. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.